Alright, so here we are continuing on with the film version of the Bonfire of the Vanities, kind of notorious for being a box office bomb, adapted from the Thomas Wolfe novel. I'll have to say it's been an extremely long time since I've seen this. I don't even know if I've ever seen it all the way through, but I figured why not give it another try on Laserdisc. Here's the rear cover. Again, standard Warner jacket, Warner artwork. No special features, not even a trailer, but letterboxed with the Dolby stereo mix as digital PCM. Other than that, pretty much a standard looking Warner release. But when discs start popping up for 50 cents or less, I just can't say no. Now we're going to move on to a disc I find quite interesting. This is the letterbox release of Days of Thunder from Paramount. Of course, many people simply describe this as Top Gun with NASCAR instead of jet fighters. And in a lot of ways, they wouldn't quite be that far off. Of course, this is another Simpson-Bruckheimer production directed by Tony Scott with Tom Cruise. And in essence, the setup is Top Gun on a racetrack. But I actually think this is the much better film. I know I'm one of the rare ones, but it has more dramatic meat on the bones. And I prefer seeing this to Top Gun if I had to choose between the two. And of course, I do love the one sheet, and I love how it looks on this disc cover. And they actually kind of gave it a fancier, it's like a flat gloss instead of the normal cardstock. They also did all the text in white and put the Simpson-Bruckheimer logo down here in the bottom corner, just to let you know who did it. Anyway, it's a very nice letterbox transfer. Has a Dolby stereo digital surround track, which sounds fantastic. Has an analog matrix track as well. Comes with a gatefold, even though the film's only on a single disc. Of course, being an earlier Paramount release, it's just graphics from the film. For some reason, they always would break up the entire usage of the gatefold with an image on either side, and then just give you a central one. I don't know why they would do that instead of just giving you an entire image across to really sell the scope idea. Maybe they could only scan so far on one of these, but still, quite nice usage of gatefold. Here's the rear cover, and even though it's a standard jacket design, I think this looks pretty good. Of course, anytime they went with just a plain black background, I think it looks pretty good. Anyway, like I said, single disc, nice transfer, and of course this film was released in the very short-lived CDS system, which was only used on a handful of titles, all of which had really inventive soundtracks for the time. CDS stands for Cinema Digital Sound. It was a methodology of encoding 5.1 sound onto 35mm and 70mm film prints, but actually encoding the full 16-bit CD quality digital PCM as actually on the film print itself. Unfortunately, it was so large and that it took up all the space to have any secondary audio track in case the CDS went out. And there were some technical snafus with the system, so it was rather common when it was used for that to go out. And without any backup audio, you just lost audio entirely. So that and the expense of getting the equipment and the license and then putting it all in is really what put the nail in the coffin for CDS. I think it was originally backed by Kodak, but it was only used a handful of times in 1990, 1991, into 92 pretty much. But like I said, all the films that it premiered with were really good for sound mixing at their time. You had Days of Thunder, The Doors is another one, so is Edward Scissorhands, and most famously Terminator 2 with its quite revolutionary for the time 5.1 sound mix. So that's why this film is important sonically, and although this Laserdisc doesn't have that track, it does have a very aggressive and wonderful Dolby Stereo surround track. And what I really like about this release is this little red banner here at the bottom. I wish more discs carried this, because you could literally put this on a lot of Laserdiscs due to them being not remixed for homes most of the time. But it says the digital tracks retain the dynamic range of the original theatrical master, and they may play louder than the analog tracks. Just basically saying, make sure you don't sit right next to your speaker and have this up loud. I love that little banner. I haven't seen it on any other release, at least of yet, and that alone made me have to have this disc. When I saw that little disclaimer, I'm like, yeah, I have to buy this just for that. I wish I could get that framed. I wish all movies were like that. But anyway, moving on to thriller I've not actually seen. This is Defenseless from Live Home Video. Not really a film I'd heard of, but seeing as it was a thriller directed by Martin Campbell, who in a couple years would go on to direct GoldenEye, I had to give it a chance. I not only have been trying to see many of the things the Bond actors have done, but if I can ever see something any of the Bond directors have done, especially more uncommon stuff like this that really hasn't gotten a lot of releases, I'll give it a shot. So I found this locally, and when I saw the cast and crew list, I figured, okay, I have to give it a shot. Digital soundtrack is Dolby Surround PCM, and yeah, it's an interesting looking cover. I'll have to check this one out. Although I'm pretty sure, I don't think this is letterboxed. I think this is 133. Yeah, I don't see any letterbox information there, but here is the interesting picture about the Blacklist and the Hewitt trials. This is Guilty by Suspicion with Robert De Niro, and of course this is all based around true events, but you know, it's got some characters that are kind of like combinations of real life characters. So it's a historical film that's about real topics, but a lot of the characters you're going to see aren't necessarily the actual people, which is, you know, is somewhat necessary in dramatization, is understandable. The film itself is actually pretty interesting. It's one of the few films that actually, you know, tries to tackle the Blacklist and the whole era of the Red Scare and actually, you know, try and do it some justice. It's not perfect, and but you know, it certainly didn't deserve to be, you know, forgotten. This is a nice letterbox release from Warner Brothers. Of course, it's a standard rear cover from them. At least the cover artwork is kind of nice. No special features or anything. You get a Dolby Surround digital track, which sounds quite nice. And this film has finally come to DVD via the Warner Archive. So before that, you were pretty much stuck having to track this down. Here is the Pioneer Vidmark reissue under the Samuel Goldwyn banner of La Femme Nikita, the remastered widescreen edition that corrects, I think the original issue had either some soundtrack or subtitling errors. So if you want this film on Laserdisc, you'll want to track this one down. Of course, uses the original artwork very wonderfully on the jacket. It's a heck of a lot better than the DVD and Blu-ray reissues in terms of artwork. Show you the rear here. You get the original French Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks, and you get a English dub of the surround mix on the analog tracks. And you don't really need the English dub, but if you want it, it's there. Of course, subtitled, and it's actually a pretty nice transfer. I haven't seen the old disc, but I've heard it's not really that great. But anyway, so I was quite happy to pick this up because all of the modern releases just have a 5.1 mix, and I kind of compared the two, and it's not really different. They didn't really change anything, but being a huge purist, I like to hear the soundtracks the way they were originally presented. And I'm like, if it's not broke, don't really fix it, or don't try to fix it, and just kind of goof stuff up. But anyway, nice transfer, nice release, the original sound mix. Other than that, you know, it corrects some flaws of an older release, and it's the best version on Laserdisc, so had to enter the collection. Here is a image release of Narrow Margin, Peter Hyams thriller with Gene Hackman and Ann Archer. Again, I don't even know if I've ever seen this entirely. I know I've seen a piece of it before on cable, but I just found this not too long ago, and again, you know, these letterbox releases, this actually is letterbox, by the way. It doesn't look it, doesn't say it on the front, but it says it down here in this little gray box. So if you weren't careful, you would think this was a pan and scan disc. It does have the Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, so I've got to check this one out. Hyams, I think, is a really underrated director. You know, he doesn't hit it out of the ballpark every time, but, you know, always he's going to produce something interesting. I think this film is certainly underrated. This is the letterbox release of The Russia House from MGM-UA. And of course, uses the original poster artwork here, and actually has a nice little mosaic tile design. I don't know if you can really see that. It's not very obvious, and it's not on the VHS or the DVD cover that uses the same artwork, but it's like a little mosaic design, just something to give it a little pizzazz and prestige to it, which is quite nice. Of course, based on the John le Carré novel, has a lovely sounding Dolby Surround digital track. And honestly, this sounds a lot better than the DVD. The DVD uses the same master as this, and the master's pretty good, but it's now been surpassed on Blu-ray. Yeah, this came out from Twilight Time, and I think it's available on some foreign Blu-ray discs as well if you're interested in that and you're in another country. But anyway, this is just a wonderful thriller. It's been a while since I've read the novel, but you know, it does a pretty good job at getting the spirit of le Carré, and that's not always an easy thing to do in a 2-hour narrative. Get an entire le Carré novel into 2 hours of movie time. And Connery is always wonderful. There's a great supporting cast, including Roy Scheider and Klaus Maria Brandauer, and of course Michelle Pfeiffer, who is wonderful. So I would definitely recommend it if you're a spy fan. If you're a le Carré fan, this is one of the, you know, few pretty darn good adaptations of one of his works, so that's easier said than done. And like I said, really great transfer and really great soundtrack on this. And of course, it has a wonderful Jerry Goldsmith score, so that in and of itself is worth watching it for. Even if you don't like the film, you can't hate the score. Here is the MCA Universal release of Sea of Love, the Pacino film from 1990. Letterbox edition. I do like the artwork. This is the original one sheet. Unfortunately, this is a ex-rental copy with some stuff I can't get off, but it's got a nice glossiness to it, even though it's a little dinged up. But again, this was just one of those I came across for really cheap, so I figured why not. Has a Matrix Dolby Surround digital track. And like I said, letterbox transfer looks pretty good for its age, and you know, it's a relatively underrated thriller, but it's been a while since I've watched it. I should watch it again, I suppose. But yeah, other than that, standard looking art, and probably the same as the VHS release in terms of that. Here is the standard letterbox release of Backdraft from MCA Universal. Of course, using the original poster art pretty well, and using a red color for the letterbox banner. It goes well with all the flames, of course. Show you the rear cover here. Nicer than usual rear cover from them, because you can't go wrong with a backdrop of flames, I suppose. Pretty nice transfer on this letterbox. It has the Dolby Surround 2.0 on the digital tracks, which seems to be the original mix for the film. I don't know if this got any 70mm blow-ups at the time in '91, but it is pretty well known for being a really good example of sound mixing for that era. And I just wanted to see the film again and hear something close to the original mix, so I can't go wrong with this one, and because it's dirt cheap, and I think this has finally come out on Blu-ray somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. So if you want it in HD, I believe it's available. Now here's an interesting one. This one is kind of forgotten these days. It's kind of been supplanted now by an extended cut on DVD. But this is the theatrical cut of Bugsy, the deluxe widescreen version from Columbia. And of course, based on the life and times of Bugsy Siegel, and directed by Barry Levinson with Warren Beatty and Annette Bening. It's an interesting film. It's, you know, if you like throwback films, gangster films, or it kind of predates a lot of what has come out on television in, you know, the past 10-15 years. Sort of, you can tell it's a little bit perhaps influenced by Goodfellas in a way, and this of course came out after Goodfellas and before Casino. But anyway, it's an interesting piece of work, and you know, it's not ever truly great, but it is very interesting and it's beautifully photographed. And despite being a Columbia release and some copies of this having rot, this copy played through just fine. And of course, I love the rear artwork here. Anytime they went for, you know, a striking image was always an improvement over a standard generic cover. Anyway, you get your chapter stops listed out here. You get a little bit of production notes and then some of the awards it was nominated for. You get a Dolby surround track on the digital tracks, which sounds wonderful, even though it's pretty much just a dialogue-heavy film. But the transfer on this is simply amazing for Laserdisc. I mean, it's really good. Like it's better than it has any reason to be. It's an early 90s disc. It's not a special edition. It doesn't have AC3. It's not an AC3 reissue, but the picture quality on this is really, really good. So you can get this for dirt cheap, and even if you don't like the film, you can use a lot of sequences in this. Just, you know, putting on a random side and flipping through it, and just to check out your setup, check out your player, you know, your settings, check out your display, you know, and how it runs with your Laserdisc. So exceptional transfer on this. Probably one of the best I've ever seen on the format. So like I said, really great transfer of an interesting, not so great, but, you know, a film that shouldn't have been just kind of like totally forgotten. And like I said, it came out on DVD. I think it's the same master as this. It was an earlier one. And then that was replaced by an extended version with some extras, which I haven't seen that version yet, but that's the most commonly available version. And I don't know which one's available for streaming, but I would assume the longer version is. But anyway, you know, if you see this for cheap and it sounds interesting, definitely check it out. If you want a really good test disc, this will do it for picture quality, absolutely. And the sound design's actually pretty good too, even though it's pretty much just dialogue heavy. Here is a later nicer looking Fox release of Class Action. Unfortunately, it is a 133 disc. I don't know if it's pan and scan or just opened up a bit. I haven't really got to play it yet, but again, anything Hackman's in, I'll at least rewatch. And of course, directed by Michael Apted, so that's also another plus. It has a Dolby Stereo digital track. And, you know, it's a nice looking release, and of course it's a little bit later of a pressing due to the nicer jacket and the Fox Video logo on front and back, so I'll have to give this one a try. I just wish it was letterboxed. To my knowledge, there was not a letterbox version. That happens sometimes, but I don't know why they wouldn't just make a letterbox version. Here's another interesting film that's kind of been left by the wayside. This is the Paramount release of Dead Again. The letterboxed edition, of course, uses the wonderful one sheet and just looks great on this. Unfortunately, this has been replaced on the DVDs, and this is one that should really hit Blu-ray. I think the photography would come off really well in HD. Of course, it's pretty well known for going between black and white and color for different sequences. The sequences in the past being black and white, the modern present-day sequences being in color. So that's making something never going to be something that's easy to transfer because of that. And in spite of that, this transfer is actually really nice. I was pleasantly surprised at how good it looked. And you know, it looks almost as good as the DVD. But of course, that's going to be a component master, so it's always going to technically look better. Sound, though, is a lot better on this. This has the original Dolby Stereo as digital PCM. Sounds great. You know, it's an interesting film. You know, it may be a touch theatrical. You know, it may be a little over the top here and there, but you know, it is quite interesting. And yeah, the central idea may be a little hokey, but you know, sometimes a little hokiness works, and this film does work. It really does. Even though maybe the first reel you might be going, I don't know, this is a little silly, I think, but you know, it really does work. And great Laserdisc, nice master, great audio track, and beautiful artwork, and a nice looking rear cover. I like the treatment to some of the stills here to kind of really put across that period feel. And then of course these two are period pieces, and then these two are present day, so that keeps the motif of going back and forth in there. you know, it's little things like that, little ideas and touches and that have really kind of been lost in packaging since we've just gone to, you know, generic Photoshop blobs, first on DVDs, then Blu-rays, and now the even more generic random images on streaming services. Anyway, if you're a fan of this film, or you like Kenneth Branagh's work, or you've just never gotten around to seeing this, or if you just come across it, absolutely recommend it. It's a really interesting film. Just watch out and don't get stuck with the pan and scan version. Here is the 1991 remake of Father of the Bride, letterbox edition. It's a Disney disc from Touchstone. Pretty nice transfer on this. Pretty much any of these letterbox transfers coming from the early 90s onward, they're, unless something went really wrong or they overused some video processing, I mean, they're all going to look pretty good. Has the original Dolby Surround track on the digital tracks. No special features or anything, but pretty much just a straightforward, solid transfer of this film, which is, you know, it's actually pretty good when you go back to it. You know, it's not the greatest, and it's not quite as silly as the sequel got, but you know, it's, of course, it's not the original 1950 film, but you know, it kind of holds its own. It does its own thing. It's not simply trying to copy every single beat of the original. And of course, the original also got, you know, a slightly silly sequel in Father's Little Dividend. So, you know, it's of course one of Steve Martin's, you know, better films from, you know, his, I guess, I don't know if you'd say his second or third period, but before, you know, we got to the more modern stuff. I really wish he'd do something more, you know, I guess at least artistically interesting, if that's a term you can apply. But anyway, it's a pretty nice Laserdisc, and it's a very common title you can get for dirt cheap if you're interested. Here is the Fox letterbox release of Grand Canyon, the Lawrence Kasdan film. Kind of more of a group ensemble piece, but a really interesting film and a nice cover. It's actually very glossy, and it's a gatefold, so it's kind of got a fancier feel to it. Of course, a later pressing, hence the Fox Video logo. A really nice gatefold that gives you a little bit on each of the main performers, and then gives you an actual gatefold image by using the title across the top. I at least like it when they try to use the entirety of the gatefold and give you some bit of, I don't know, some bit of scope, I guess. Again, letterbox transfer, a Dolby Surround digital track, which sounds pretty good. And, you know, it's a pretty good looking disc. This film only made it to DVD, and it's not really a fancy DVD or anything. So I don't know if Kasdan's other films are going to eventually hit HD. Only a few have. I think pretty much it's just Big Chill and Silverado, and of course Body Heat made it to Blu-ray from Warner Brothers. So, but you know, hopefully some of these others will eventually hit. It's not like we haven't had HD for long enough for a lot of these deeper catalog titles to start appearing somewhere. But anyway, it's an interesting film, and it's kind of one that's, again, kind of gotten forgotten. Here is the letterbox release of JFK, the theatrical version, which is pretty much unavailable these days after it's been supplanted by the director's cut, which adds in a lot of scenes that are really, in my opinion, kind of unnecessary. Of course, replicates the original one sheet very well, I believe. This is just a beautiful looking cover, and if they ever go with a different one, they'll just be conning themselves, because it's not going to be as good as this. Gatefold release just uses pretty much critical blurbs and placades and you know, winner of 2 Academy Awards, but you know, at least it looks relatively impressive. And you get a little picture with some diagrams of the infamous book depository in Dealey Plaza. So not the best gatefold, but at least, you know, tries to give you some impression of how important the film is supposed to be. And of course you get more of it here with, you know, a knockout, a 4-star masterpiece, da 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 da. Anyway, so at least you do get some prestige from this release, at least the packaging, which always helps, even if you haven't seen the film. Letterboxed, actually a pretty good transfer, and of course this film uses a lot of different formats, and it has, you know, black and white sequences, newsreel footage, you know, elements of the Zapruder footage, so it's not going to be an easy film to transfer. It's not just, you know, a one and done at all. So this is actually a really impressive Laserdisc in terms of getting all that across and not detracting from anything, being just a composite video master. Beautiful Dolby Surround digital track on this, and this pretty well replicates probably what you would have seen on the general 35mm release. Of course, this being 91, it predated 5.1, and that's what you'll find on the DVDs and Blu-rays. In addition, they are the director's cut, not the theatrical version. So if you want to see the theatrical version, you have to either get this, or I think the very first DVD is the theatrical cut and uses this same master. But it's a very old DVD in one of those snapper cases, so it's not going to look very pretty in terms of the tech specs. But anyway, like I said, I think the theatrical version of this runs a lot better. It's a lot smoother and makes a lot more sense than the director's cut. And of course, it's a lot shorter. So, but anyway, if you're interested or if you see this, I definitely recommend it. I do think the film has some problems, but the attempt, the intent behind it, I think, is more important than any flaws that are ultimately there. But and I actually think the regular Blu-ray of the director's cut is actually going out of print. I think you have to get a foreign version, so I don't know if they're going to reissue it at any time, but that's just something to be aware of. But I definitely recommend picking this up. You can get it for practically nothing, and beautiful artwork, and you do get to see the theatrical cut with the original audio mix. Here is the Paramount letterbox release of the really interesting Steven Soderbergh picture, Kafka, with Jeremy Irons, and a really interesting cast. Of course, it's a film that is both black and white and color, like Dead Again, so a really interesting and pretty difficult film to transfer, especially in the composite video world. Also an interesting release because this is a Miramax title that got put out on Paramount, so I can't remember if they did the theatrical distribution or not, but they have the home video rights, so it's odd to see another studio logo label on a normal release. So this is kind of like Days of Thunder with that Simpson Bruckheimer logo on it. But anyway, really nice jacket, beautiful looking artwork, and again, I haven't seen this in so long, but I'm really wanting to go back and check it out again. I think Soderbergh's earlier work to me is much more interesting than the stuff he does nowadays, which, you know, he does all the work in the digital realm. He was really a pioneer of red cameras and all that stuff. And while that's fine and dandy for some people, I'm much more interested in the, well, at least in the more human and arty stuff he did back in the film realm. And especially Sex, Lies, and Videotape, of course, which has just now come out in a beautiful new Criterion edition on Blu-ray. Anyway, nice looking jacket as well. The all black really goes well with the film theme. And I love this little note that talks about, during the shooting and during all the hectic times, I really look forward to when I could just sit down and enjoy the film without having to worry about editing it on a nice pristine Laserdisc. So you guys can now enjoy that pleasure. And it's actually signed by Soderbergh himself. So I just think that's a nice little cheeky note. And it just kind of makes this really stick out all the more. Letterbox transfer has a Dolby Stereo digital track, which when I watched this when I originally got it, sounded quite nice, so I've got to spin it up again. And from what I remembered, the transfer is pretty good. So again, not an easy film to transfer, and not a film that's really talked about very much. I know it came out on DVD, but I don't think it's hit Blu-ray yet either. So if you want to see this and you want a PCM version of the original sound mix, this is what you're going to go for. I don't think well, I know it came out in Dolby Stereo SR because it's a 91 release, being a regular 35mm exhibition. So this is going to have a PCM version of the original soundtrack. So what's not to love? Here's just a great picture. This is the Warner's letterbox release of The Last Boy Scout, the film that was famous for being a record-breaking screenplay sale for Shane Black selling his script and a package deal. If I remember correctly, it was for over $1 million at the time. Essentially, this film is if you crossed Die Hard with 48 Hours, in a sense. You have a mismatched duo. It's extremely dark and gritty, like the first two Die Hard films and 48 Hours. And I guess if you really wanted to kind of link them, you could say maybe this was sort of an inspiration to what came out in the new pairing and Die Hard with a Vengeance, or Die Hard 3, of putting like the kind of grizzled McClane with a completely different character and pairing them together. But anyway, I love this film. It's got a really sick, dark sense of humor. It's really gritty, and but in a good way. And when it goes over the top, it really goes over the top. But it's extremely enjoyable and super stylized. It was directed by Tony Scott. So if you know anything of Shane Black and anything of Tony Scott, you already know what you're in for, and the performances are just really great. I'll show you the rear jacket. Of course, the cover is wonderful. The transfer is actually pretty good too. It's letterbox with a Dolby Stereo surround track. This film was also released in 70mm blow-up prints, so the 5.1 that's on the Blu-ray and DVD are pretty much derived from that. But still, this sounds quite nice, and it's what you would have heard in the regular 35mm screenings. Chapter stops, nothing in terms of special features. It's a plain Warner's release, and you know, it's a relatively common title, but it actually took me quite a while to find it. The first DVD, well, the only DVD, was an early snapper case release that ported this, and it was actually pretty notorious for having really poor video quality. It just bumped up the sound to a 5.1 track, but it was an early Warner snapper case, had a ton of video noise, and it just really took this master and made it look really kind of ugly, like a lot of very early DVDs. And it wasn't until the Blu-ray came out as part of a Bruce Willis double feature disc that it actually got a really decent transfer. It's only a single layered disc, but it has big improvements in color, and you get a lossless 5.1 track. Unfortunately, this film's never gotten a special edition or any extras, and it barely gets mentioned these days, but I kind of look at it as a quasi, maybe alternate Die Hard 3. You know, if you took, again, if you took the realms of Die Hard, or at least the first two that were a lot darker, and 48 Hours and Lethal Weapon, and you kind of put them all in a cauldron and, you know, put them in a pot, you know, and just let them stew for a while, you'd kind of get something like this. So yeah, it's just a really interesting film. It's got a really wicked sense of humor, and I definitely recommend it if you like any of those classic 80s action franchises. I just wish it was better known, and hopefully one day it might get a special edition. But in any case, the Laserdisc is great, and that first DVD is pretty crummy, and there's a nice Blu-ray available for cheap if you're interested. I haven't seen this film yet, but again, I'm eager to see anything any of the main Bond actors did otherwise in their career. This is a film called Livewire with Pierce Brosnan, one of his, well, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but he did a number of films that were either espionage-related thrillers or just straight action films in between Remington Steele and eventually getting back to Bond in GoldenEye. So I've been meaning to see all of these, and let me show you the rear cover here. It's an image disc. It's only 133. There's a, I think there's a letterbox DVD floating around somewhere, but I believe it's pretty rare and hard to come by. This has the original audio as digital PCM. I believe it's, yeah, it is Dolby Surround encoded. It's very tiny down there. Distributed by Image from New Line Home Video. But yeah, this film, there's some, you know, it has some decent reviews and such, and it's not like it's the greatest thing in the world, but Again, I just find it really interesting to see the main Bond actors in other roles, either before or afterwards. And I really try to see everything they've done, because I feel in a lot of ways that getting the Bond role really undercuts your reputation as an actor. It took Connery a very long time to establish career traction afterwards and actually be able to branch out and do other things. So I just like seeing them pop up in anything, so I figured I had to check this out. So if you're wanting it on Laserdisc or you're interested in seeing the film, you'll have to pick up this version. I want to say there's an earlier release with analog audio, but again, this is a 133 disc. I haven't cracked it open yet, but I don't know if it's an open mat-ed or just pan and scan transfer. Again, there is a DVD somewhere, but I don't think it's that easily available, and I think a letterbox version is kind of hard to find, at least from what I've heard. Now here's a really nice release of what was really underrated for a while, but is now kind of viewed, I think, as a more modern classic. This is the Fox letterbox release of Point Break. A really surprisingly great film that is far better than what you would think. Has a style all of its own, courtesy of Catherine Bigelow, who directed it. This is actually quite a nice pressing. It's a later Fox disc, hence the Fox Video logo. Letterboxed with a really nice Dolby Surround track. It's actually quite powerfully mixed. This film did get 70mm blow-up prints, so later releases with 5.1 will be derived from that. Pretty nice bit of production notes and a nice looking gatefold. You could tell this is when Fox was starting to get better about their jacket design. The text is a bit smaller so they can fit more. It just looks a bit better laid out, and the stills are better put across the rear, and it's not just the generic plain gray Fox rear cover. It's spread across 3 sides. Side 3 is CAV encoded and does look a tiny bit better than the CLV sides, but it's actually a nice clean transfer, and I was surprised at how good and bombastic the Dolby Surround was, especially of course during the surfing and wave sequences and then the skydiving sequences. You really don't lose a whole lot from not having the 5.1 discrete tracks. It would have been nice had this gotten an AC3 release, but this is actually quite a nice disc, and of course you can pick it up on DVD if you don't have it already, and it's been issued on Blu-ray a couple times with a kind of spattering of special features, but I think it really could use a nice special edition if it does come to 4K. Which I think it would be a good selling title. They felt it good enough to do a terrible remake of it, so yeah, don't bother with the remake. But anyway, this really is one of those 90s films that's finally come around, and there's a lot of critics who liked it at the time. There's a lot more who like it now, and this is one that I think really kind of deserves its modern classic status, I guess you would put it. So really nice title, and you can get it for pretty cheap. I'm sorry this one's a little beat up. This is the Paramount letterbox release of Regarding Henry, the Mike Nichols picture that's one of Harrison Ford's more dramatic performances. You can always use this as a counter argument to those who say, Harrison Ford just plays the same thing over and over, which is totally not true. It's the same argument that you have to use with the classic Hollywood stars, where people who just want to generalize and say, oh, they just played themselves. That's not the case at all. Anyway, pretty nice looking but simple Paramount release. I like how they went with just sort of a light cover here, light color back here. And it's a little dinged up, but the disc is fine and the transfer's fine. It's letterbox, looks pretty good, and has a Dolby Stereo surround track, digital, which is always helpful. I think this got bumped up to 5.1 for the DVD releases. And this film is probably most known these days for being really what got one J.J. Abrams started, because this was really his first major credit, and he was credited as the screenwriter. This was his pretty much his story he kind of shepherded to the screen. So anyway, that's why most people might know it these days. I also think it's kind of funny when people are credited by their full names earlier on. As you can see, it's Jeffrey, not JJ. Anyway, so yeah, it's a pretty nice release, and you know, if you just want to see this again and it's been a while, or you want a PCM rendering of the original audio, then you can definitely pick this up. Now here's one that has a little bit of, I guess you'd say a little bit of prestige packaging. Not really a whole lot of special features or anything, but I just really like the packaging, and it's important to have, as it is the theatrical cut of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. This is a it's really an interesting film because it has fantastic production design. Its heart is in the right place, but overall, as an adaptation of Robin Hood, for me, it's never quite worked. I think it's kind of got a mishmash tonally, in terms of, you know, being a straight adventure film, being sort of a modernized look at these classic stories, and you know, where on one hand it wants to be serious and epic, a la Dances with Wolves, which had just come out, or you know, be rousing and classic in swashbuckling style as Adventures of Robin Hood, and it kind of gets lost in between those two, I think. Now, this is the 1991 theatrical version. They later made a extended director's cut, which came out on DVD and Blu-ray, and that's the version we've been primarily stuck with ever since. And that version, I think, adds, it's about 20 to 25 minutes of additional material that was cut out. A lot of it is kind of weird and not really necessary, and I think it really makes the movie drag on a lot. However, once you've seen those scenes, it's kind of hard in some instances to go back to the shorter version, but I definitely think the shorter version runs better. And outside of the very first DVD, which was a port of this as the theatrical cut, all the other versions are the longer director's cut. So they really should do a reissue with a new transfer that gives you the option to choose which version you like. But anyway, it's actually a really nice package. You get just sort of a prestigious looking bit of text on the gatefold, and it's a whole gatefold image, which I always prefer. It just looks really nice. And I like the use of all the greens and browns on everything, because it, of course, matches the production design, which, again, is really spot on, I think, in terms of, you know, giving it a realistic touch. And of course, this is still all in the pre-CG realm, so that's another reason you can at least go back to this and, you know, admire the photography and the production design. Nice looking rear cover, simple but effective, and I think, again, gives it some prestige. Interestingly, it includes the music video for the accompanying Bryan Adams song, but funnily enough, I don't know why they did this. They put it not at the end as you would expect, but they put it at the very beginning of side one. So as soon as you put the disc on, it just goes right into the music video before you've even seen the film again. But I guess it sets the mood in a sort of overture style way, but I think it would be much better if it had been put at the end of side 3. But anyway, as a bonus, you get the music video in PCM sound, so it sounds great. Transfer is actually quite nice. You know, if you've seen a Warner disc from the early 90s, you kind of know what it's going to look like. You know, they were all solid transfers at this stage. You get the Dolby Stereo Surround original audio, it's digital PCM. It sounds great. I actually think it sounds better than the 5.1 remix on the DVD and Blu-ray, because this film was not blown up to 70mm, so the 2.0 matrix is the original audio. So again, you can find this for dirt cheap. It's very common, and if you've never seen it or you want to see the theatrical cut again, I highly recommend this. Otherwise, you're going to have to track down that very first DVD and probably pay more for, you know, an early DVD copy of this same disc with lossy audio. So now here's a film I picked up. I have never seen this, but I pretty much just got it for the 2 leads. This is True Colors, a Paramount release. This is a 1991 film that I have never seen, but I figure anything with John Cusack and James Spader in it, I have to give it a shot because I love them both. This is unfortunately a 133 disc. It has a Dolby Surround digital track, so again, I don't know if it's pan and scan or open matted, but this is the only Laserdisc release, and I think the DVD is the same way. Not really that common of a film, and certainly one I'd never really heard of, but again, with these 2 leads, I figured why not. Just wish it had been letterboxed. Now this is a very important Laserdisc release, and I'd say for actually a number of reasons. This is the live home video release of Abel Ferrara's Bad Lieutenant, which is one of the best films of the 1990s and an incredible piece of work. It's probably an absolute crime that Harvey Keitel did not win the Best Actor Oscar for this film. This is one of the most harrowing lead performances you'll see in any picture. And it's not the easiest film to watch at all. This is the uncut version. This is what was originally rated NC-17 and was not even stocked at Blockbusters and major video chains. And it took me quite a while to actually see this. I first saw a version of the DVD, which went in and out of print, and now it's available on Blu-ray and such. But what's interesting about this film is it was originally released with a song on the soundtrack, Schoolie D's Signifying Rapper, which uses the main riff from Led Zeppelin's Kashmir. It samples it, but instead of doing a direct sample, it's actually, the riff is performed live in the studio, so it's not quite a just a regular sampling of the real Zeppelin recording. But anyway, the song had been released in the late 80s, and the film was released in 91, 92, and after it did its theatrical release, Jimmy Page and the band, I guess, but I think it's pretty much Jimmy Page. Anyway, they brought up a lawsuit against the song and the film, and even though the song had already been out a couple years, and it was eventually settled, I think it was settled out of court, but they had to then take the film back and remove all instances of the song, and they also did a little tiny bit of editing, and I think pretty much just one but very pivotal scene, and replaced it with new music, and that's what you find on all video copies. So it's not really going to ruin the film, but it's not the original intended experience, and the only way you can actually see the film as originally intended with the original song in it is either if you catch a extremely rare print screening at an art house theater, which is extraordinarily rare. This was a very low budget film, and really did not get the distribution it deserved. But you also can go to this live home video Laserdisc release. Now, supposedly they were all recalled to be issued with the, you know, edited, corrected, legal soundtrack. And according to the LDDB page, you know, you can look at the specific ISBN number barcode to get the correct version. However, when I picked this disc up, it doesn't have the correct barcode, but the disc itself is actually the uncut disc with the original soundtrack. So if you do find this, don't go by the jacket, because chances are your disc will actually have the uncut version with the song, and the song appears in several places in the end credits. So if you watch it, I think it's the first instance of it in the film is somewhere around the 15 or 20 minute mark. You'll know pretty quick. And if you've never heard the song, you can look it up on YouTube. It's been uploaded in a lot of places. But anyway, this is an incredible film. It's very dark. Very, very gritty. And funnily enough, what really cracks me up is it was originally intended as a dark comedy with Christopher Walken. This was supposed to be the follow-up to what he and Ferrara did on King of New York. But eventually that just didn't come to pass, and Harvey Keitel stepped in, and almost all that black humor just kind of went out, and this became a straight, harrowing, extraordinarily dark picture. For those who have never seen it before, I really am not going to go into any plot details, because it's really more of a, I guess you could say it's more of a couple of days in the life of a particular character, and that character is a lieutenant in the New York police force who really has hit beyond rock bottom, and just how he moves through the seedy cesspool that was still New York at the time. So it's absolutely recommended, but you know, don't watch it if you want happy endings or you want to feel good about yourself afterwards. It is extraordinarily dark, but it is an essential Laserdisc to have the uncut soundtrack, and it's a 133 transfer, which actually is pretty much an open matte transfer. Some theatrical screenings were actually 133. This was a low-budget film, so there's some debate on whether it's supposed to be 133 or matted to 185. The DVDs and Blu-rays are a 178 transfer. It's actually a really nice transfer. I like seeing it in the 133 format extremely well. I think it really fits the film actually better than the matted widescreen presentation. The Blu-ray is dirt cheap and available, and has a commentary from Ferrara and I believe the co-writer or producer, I can't remember exactly. I think it's actually the producer. But anyway, it's a nice commentary track if you want some extras for the film. But again, extremely important Laserdisc of a great film. Just, you know, double check, actually play the disc itself, and see for yourself if you have the cut version or the uncut version. Here is the Pioneer Special Edition reissue of Basic Instinct, the director's cut. This, I think, kind of builds off what Paramount did with their director series. Of course, you see this is touting interviews and director's commentary and letterbox. The cover's printed very nice, and I like the imagery, although I wish they would have just stuck with the original poster artwork that's on the normal releases. That's kind of the, it's not black and white, but it's the blue and white tinted image that was on the original posters. But at least the different image kind of helps differentiate this from the normal releases. Anyway, it's got an extremely nice gatefold, kind of like a handful of various editions, and a few trifold Criterions is actually printed sideways. So it's definitely an interesting looking disc. I'm trying to show you as best as I can from this angle. And it actually has the Pioneer Special Edition logo printed across the top again. So this in and of itself, I think, makes this a worthier purchase than the normal version. So you can tell they put a little bit of thought into repackaging this. Now, again, this is the unrated, uncut, original version of the film with a new letterbox transfer. You get an introduction from Paul Verhoeven. I always mispronounce that. Paul Verhoeven, and I'm probably still messing that up. Anyway, so you get a video introduction from him. There's a commentary, a director commentary on the analog right track. You get, it's called a scrapbook, but it's a mixture of video stills and little bits of footage at the end on side 4. The film is spread across 3 sides. Let me make sure. Yeah, it's spread across 3 sides, and then the extras start at the end of side 3 and go on to side 4. It's a mixture of, it's mostly CLV, and then the very end of the film is in CAV. But it's, again, a much nicer packaging and much nicer transfer than the older discs, and still a very common release, even though it is a special edition. I think they printed and sold a lot of these, so it's pretty easy to find. You get a Dolby Surround 2.0 track, which sounds great. And I've seen this on Blu-ray, I think, once. And I think all of those have a 5.1 remix. I think they've added a couple extras, but since I got this, I never bought the Blu-ray myself. So I guess I'll have to check that out and see if it has any really good additional features, but I'm actually quite satisfied with this. It looks great. It's better than the originals. It has some nice extras and good soundtrack, so I definitely recommend this one. If you're looking for a copy of Basic Instinct, I'd say go for this one. It's cheap, affordable, and better than the original issues. Here is the Neil Jordan picture, The Crying Game. Just a lovely cover. I just really appreciate it when they keep the original imagery, and it just makes a striking Laserdisc jacket. And, you know, they keep the logos to a minimum, and, you know, they've even grayed them out so they just kind of fit in with the black cover. Nice, simple letterbox disc. Letterboxed with a Dolby Surround digital track, which sounds great. That's how the film was originally shown, so all the 5.1s are remixes. This is one of those films that you need to just go in cold. Do not let people spoil it for you. It's one of those that if it does get spoiled for you, it really harms the storytelling. So, you know, it's just one of those relatively famous films from the early 90s that I think everybody should at least see once. And you do get the color bars at the end, which is a nice touch. That's mainly a Criterion hallmark, so it's nice to see it actually pop up on other people's discs. And this is extraordinarily common. You can get it for super cheap. Here is a rather nice Warner Bros. Release. This is the letterbox release of Falling Down. The Joel Schumacher picture that's got quite a bit of social commentary in it. And for a Warner's disc, this is, you know, a little bit better packaging. I love the artwork using the original poster image on the front, and then I love the choice of stills on the back here. Just looks classier than that, you know, standard Warner jacket with the black square and then the random colors with pictures on the side. Simple disc, two-sided single disc with a nice letterbox transfer that has a Dolby Stereo digital track, which sounds great. The original mix, no remixed audio, which is great. Unfortunately, no special features, and I think there's a handful on the like maybe one or two on the later releases. But if you're wanting to see this film again and you haven't seen it in a while, or you come across it on Laserdisc, absolutely recommended. Nice disc, nice transfer, and the original artwork on the original audio track and lossless, which is always great. Here's a pretty common release in one of those funny packagings. This is the Columbia letterbox release of A Few Good Men, the Rob Reiner film that, of course, everybody knows for how it's able to handle the truth. Sorry for the bad pun. You get a simple gatefold. It's pretty much comprised of imagery and all of the lovely critical blurbs. Now, what's interesting about this disc is it's packaged in the old Unipack style that was used on a handful of LPs back in the day, and your discs come out here. And to me, and I know a lot of other people, this has always been one of the most annoying usages of packaging. It's like, why wouldn't you just have a gatefold if you're already going to have a gatefold? Why not just have a normal one? This is very easy to ding up or rip or tear, and then it's hard to work your discs in and out. It's just an annoyance. And thankfully, I don't think this was used very many times on Laserdisc. I think it's actually more common to have the discs that open with a gatefold and have like an actual plastic caddy tray, like some of the early releases of Silence of the Lambs by Orion. But other than that, you know, it's actually nicely packaged. It's got a lot of nicely detailed notes and a small print, like a number of Columbia discs. It's spread across 3 sides, and the transfer is actually pretty darn good. Of course, being a Columbia disc, some I know will have brought somewhere probably, but I didn't have any issues with this one, and I don't think it's really a heavy rodder or anything, so feel free to pick it up for $1 when you find it. It's extremely common. Again, nice transfer. It has the original Dolby Surround as digital PCM, so it sounds great. Of course, the film's come out on practically every format since, so it's going to look and sound good on any format. It's even come out on 4K UHD. It was one of Sony's earlier titles, so if you want to see it in really high quality, you can pick up the UHD, but the Laserdisc is actually quite nice, and it has the original sound mix. No special features, so you'll have to pick up later releases for that, but again, it's just a nice little release with, you know, kind of odd packaging and, you know, original artwork, so who's to say no when some of these are less than $1? Now here's another one that you have to get the theatrical original version. This is Michael Mann's version of The Last of the Mohicans, a Letterbox Fox release, and just beautiful looking jacket with the original poster artwork. And as you can see, they even left the bottom black bar off. They did that on a number of releases. I don't know what that really indicates, but it's just one of those where that just jumps out to me, where they just put the black bar on the top. So again, this is one of the only releases of the original theatrical cut. Mann later went on and did a director's cut for home video releases, and that's what you find on the DVDs and Blu-rays, which made a number of changes, and I then added a bunch of scenes, if I remember correctly. So it's really kind of a different experience than this theatrical cut. And I want to say there's actually more than 2 versions. I think there may be a third, if I'm remembering correctly. I may be a little off on that, but I know there's at least 2, if not 3 versions now. So it's a nice transfer with a nice amount of production notes in addition to the story blurb. Simple disc otherwise, single disc, 2-sided with a nice Fox letterbox transfer. Has a Dolby Stereo digital track, which sounds quite nice. However, this disc was later supplanted by a much harder to find AC3 reissue, which practically looks identical, even though it came out much later. Of course, on the shrink wrap you get the THX sticker, but here on the cover, the only way to tell on the front is you get a tiny little THX logo stamped in there. And the actual material, cardboard, is a little bit thinner, so you know, the actual printing is a little sleeker and such. But anyway, you also get the little THX stamp back here, and then a little mention of Dolby Digital AC3 over here. Other than that, it's the same jacket design, and you do get the original theatrical trailer on this disc, which is not on the previous disc. It doesn't list it here because that's the same, but it's actually printed down here. So that's another small addition they made. Otherwise, it seems to be pretty much the same transfer if you compare the two. This one's just going to be a little bit sharper and less noisy because it's disc pressed much later. Of course, the THX mastering stamp of approval was really more of just a really kind of, well, it wasn't really a sales gimmick like it became later on in the DVD era, but even with the THX mastering stamp, they were known to, you know, have a bunch of mistakes slip out, and there were a number of discs that had to be recalled or corrected, even with the THX stamp on it. So that was really more of just a, you know, this disc should be, you know, technically great, and not necessarily, you know, it's 100% perfect. So anyway, if you want to see the theatrical cut, you can go with either disc. The old release is much easier to find and much cheaper. You definitely have to dig around a lot more to find this with the AC3 track. But that said, the AC3 does sound quite nice. I don't know if I'd call it, you know, leaps and bounds above the Matrix PCM. But, you know, it definitely is an improvement in some ways, particularly in the score and channel separation. But, you know, if you come across this release, you know, I'd definitely say go for it. You don't have much to lose if it's not expensive. But I wouldn't lose any sleep over just having the older disc. But either one is important to see the original theatrical cut, which is still pretty much MIA on modern formats. Here is the unrated director's cut of The Lawnmower Man, based on the Stephen King story. Nice looking jacket, and it's been a long while since I've seen this, so I've got to fire this Laserdisc up and check out the transfer. Columbia release from New Line with a Dolby Stereo surround track, which should be quite nice. Spread across 3 sides, with the final side being CAV. I just love the silver packaging of this, even though the text is extremely small and you kind of have to move it closer and back and forward and really kind of focus hard to read it. But that's pretty much common on a lot of 90s Columbia releases. So anyway, nicer release, and I think this was supplanted by a very late letterboxed release. I think that may have had AC3 as well. That version is really hard to find and gets quite pricey. This version is pretty common, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think this may be a 133 transfer. I don't think it's letterboxed, but again, you do get the uncut director's version with a Dolby Surround digital track. So if you want to see the film again or you've never seen it, definitely say you can pick it up, because it's usually dirt cheap. It's relatively common, and I think the packaging is quite nice despite the extremely small text. Here's another that I have not seen in a long time. This is Medicine Man from Touchstone, so it's a Disney disc. Letterboxed, directed by John McTiernan, with a Dolby Surround digital track. Rear cover. Of course, it's the same Disney style design. The layout's almost identical in all these discs, but I do like how they do give you the tropical background, which, you know, at least looks interesting instead of just a generic background color. Simple looking disc, 2-sided single disc, so I've got to fire this up and actually rewatch this film. I'm also kind of going back and looking at a lot of McTiernan's other films, because I think he really is quite underrated. And you know, he's getting a few he's been getting a few jobs here and there recently, so I'd really like to see him come back and really, you know, knock it out of the park again and do something interesting. And anyway, from what I remember, this is an interesting film, and anything with Connery in it always has to, you know, have some, he always brings something to it, even if it's completely wild and wacky like Zardoz, or totally crummy like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But what can I say? I even have a soft spot for the Avengers, so. But admittedly, that film was mutilated by Warner Brothers, so you have to at least give it that. Here is the Warner Brothers letterbox release of Passenger 57, a surprisingly good 90s action film with Wesley Snipes. You know, it seems like it would just be dull and average, but, you know, surprisingly, it works pretty well. Of course, I'm going off my memory because I haven't seen it in a while, so I'm kind of excited to fire this up again. Letterbox transfer has a 2.0 Dolby Surround PCM track. There was a late release of this with AC3 added, so if you want to find that version, it's pretty much the same cover. It's just going to have a little slightly different catalog number, and I think a tiny mention of AC3 somewhere, but otherwise they look identical. And the 2.0 is probably the way to go with this, because that's how it was originally heard in the theatrical exhibition. So gonna have to fire this one up and check out the transfer, but still, it's a nice looking release, nice artwork, and a heck of a lot better looking than the DVD in terms of cover. So I think the DVD kept that 5.1 track, but it was a snapper case release. Here's one I have not seen, but I've kind of wanted to for a while. This is the Universal Letterbox release of The Public Eye, which, if I remember correctly, is actually not available on DVD, or if it is, it's just a pan and scan disc. Of course, you can get it on laser or VHS, but I think the only way to see it letterboxed is on this particular Laserdisc. So this is one of those that you just have to track down if you want to see the film properly. Dolby Surround PCM digital track, letterbox transfer. I kind of took a glance at it. I popped it in for a sec, but I haven't gotten time to watch it all the way through. And I've never seen this before, so it just seemed interesting. And anything that's a period film, I have to give a try, because I'm a sucker for pulp novels, crime novels, hard-boiled fiction. That's totally been my thing since I was a kid. So any type of period film, I will absolutely give a shot, and then hopefully not wince too much if the period isn't done too well. Alrighty, so moving on to Thunderheart. This is a interesting film. I haven't seen it in a while, directed by Michael Apted, and if you're a Val Kilmer fan, it's definitely worth a watch. It's been a long time since I've seen it, and unfortunately this is a relatively well-known rotter disc among Laserdisc collectors. It is a Sony Columbia DADC pressing, and I haven't got a chance to go through this 100%, but I know there are people who have had clean copies out there. But this is one that's known to have copies that are rotted to death and give out somewhere, and that's the worst feeling, to be watching a movie and get into it, or get even over halfway through or near the end and then have it crap out on you. So I'm gonna have to spin this up and see if it has any rot, or how bad, or hopefully it's not critical or anything. Other than that, it's a nice jacket. I did put it in when I got it and checked out a couple chapter stops, and the transfer looked good. The spots I checked didn't really have any rot or speckling, but like I said, I haven't had a chance to go all the way through it. So just be forewarned, this is a disc that is well known for having rot issues. It has a Dolby Surround digital PCM track, which again, when I sampled it, sounded nice. You do get some nice production notes about the film. Other than that, standard Columbia letterbox release. So if you're looking for this film and you want to see it, it is available on DVD, but if you pick up the Laserdisc, just know that it is known to be pretty rot prone. Here is, without a doubt, the best Steven Seagal film and the best Die Hard ripoff, essentially. This is Under Siege. Really doesn't need much of an introduction, but it is a really well-made, competent action thriller. It's far better than it really deserves to be. I think a lot of the credit for that goes to Andrew Davis's direction, who pretty much directed all of the best Steven Seagal films, and this is the film that essentially led to The Fugitive being made. So it's a really good action thriller. It's definitely the best Seagal film, and it's actually a really nice Laserdisc. Of course, this copy is a little dinged up, but I don't mind that if the disc is fine and I pick it up for cheap. Anyway, it's actually a really nice transfer. Letterboxed Warner release, a nicer jacket than they usually give you, a really nice rear cover for a Warner release too. Best of all is the Dolby Surround. The Dolby Stereo SR track is the original theatrical audio. This film was not released in the 5.1 era, and it has insanely good sound design for the era, at least I think. It's a really competent, really well done Dolby SR mix, and it sounds fantastic as this digital PCM rendering. So it's definitely worth the buck or two it costs to pick this thing up, and it definitely sounds better than the DVD audio. If I remember correctly, the Blu-ray has lossy audio here in the States. I think the British disc, the British Blu-ray has lossless audio, but as far as I'm concerned, you can't get better than the original mix. And like I said, just a really solid, really well done action thriller. Yes, it's a little over the top and a little cheesy at times, but the performances of Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey are wonderful as the nasty evildoers. It's just, it's actually surprisingly quite a load of fun. And yeah, it's one of those few times where I go, you know what? I like a Steven Seagal film. And there is some charm to even some of his lesser films, so definitely give this one a shot. It's a great Laserdisc, and another one of these films that I just was really surprised by when I came back and watched it again on Laserdisc, just how much it actually held up, even though it is completely Die Hard put on a boat, but it actually goes a bit beyond that and actually has a life of its own, which was quite a surprise. It's a heck of a lot better than I remembered, and it's a really great Laserdisc with the original sound design fully intact. So pick it up for the soundtrack alone. or if you haven't seen it in a long time, or if you've never seen it. It's a very common title, highly recommended, and unlike the sequel, this is a perfectly fine disc. The sequel has a lot of rot issues, so I would say avoid the sequel on Laserdisc, pick that up on DVD or a Japanese pressing. Here's a film I have never seen. It just looks rather interesting. It's Unlawful Entry, a Fox letterbox release. Again, I just thought the cover art looked interesting. I loved the design, and it was literally 50 cents. So I picked this up not too long ago. She had another disc of something I've not gotten to see yet. I've never heard of, so I figured I'll give it a shot. It's a later Fox pressing. It's a '93 film, so you get the Fox Video logo. Nice looking cover. You get a little bit of production notes mixed in with the regular cover blurb. No special features. Has a Dolby Surround digital PCM track, so should be pretty nice when I finally get a chance to spin this up. I started picking up so many 90s films simply because they're dirt cheap on Laserdisc, and even if the film's no good, I get to at least check out the tech specs of how the studio was doing at that time of their disc pressing. So I'll give anything a shot if it looks interesting, and when they're this cheap, who's to say no? Here is the letterbox special edition of A Bronx Tale, Robert De Niro's directorial debut, and it's via HBO video, so it's kind of got a different packaging style. It's a letterbox transfer with a Dolby Surround digital PCM track. And again, it's been a long time since I've seen this, but when I saw this for dirt cheap, I figured I had to pick it up and figured it was much overdue for a rewatch. Anyway, it's spread across 3 sides. I do believe there is another version that is, I want to say there's a pan and scan version of this, but that's actually more common. I may be wrong. I know, if I remember correctly, there's 2 versions of this floating around. But again, I just came across this in the bins, and it's been a long time since I've seen it, so I figured why not. And it is a nice looking letterbox issue with the original sound mix. So again, if you're looking for this film on Laserdisc, why not? Now here's just a heck of a Laserdisc package. This is the Pioneer Special Edition of Cliffhanger. I should say the deluxe version. Now, of course, Cliffhanger has had a multitude of releases across all formats. It was even released on Muse High Vision in Japan, the very early 90s HD video variant that could essentially give you 1080i, kind of piggybacking off of the Laserdisc system. And it's really a technical marvel. I highly recommend you check that out if you've never looked at it or heard of it. It's just a technical marvel how they're able to pack all this stuff in. But I digress. Anyway, this is a beautiful package, and it's far advanced over the normal kind of plain first issue. And Cliffhanger had several releases on Laserdisc. If you're wanting the version with all of the extras they made, you're going to have to track down this version. Unfortunately, it has a really bad pressing flaw on the first edition, which is actually this version, the deluxe CAV version. The film is presented in CAV here, and then you get the extras at the end. But unfortunately, the pressing flaw, and I found this out in person, I had read there was a flaw on the LTTB listing, but I didn't realize exactly what it was because it didn't go into a lot of details at first. And so fortunately, I had picked up the corrected version for really cheap, which is the same packaging. They just changed the CAV film disc to a regular CLV disc. It's the same transfer and everything, it's just on CLV instead of full CAV. The problem with this release is, for some reason, at the end of every side, there's a bad bit of encoding. So depending on your player, it's either going to lock up, or on mine, it simply starts, freezes at a certain point, and then starts looping the same 15 to 20 seconds over and over and over and over and over again until you actually get up and stop your player. And it does this on every single side to an extremely hilarious effect. Like I said, when I put this on, I had no idea exactly what the flaw was or if it was on all of them. And as far as I can tell, it is on all of these CAV versions, so you'll need to have the CLV reissue to actually be able to watch the film in its entirety. And I did compare the CAV disc on here for the regular parts that worked fine and the CLV disc, and there's not a whole lot of noticeable difference, so it's not like you really need both. But let me show you this. This is a beautiful package. It's the same on both. It's just the chapter listings are kind of moved around because the reissue went to a CLV disc. It's a beautiful looking trifold, much like Criterion trifold would be. You get a letter from director Renny Harlin here. You get some nice imagery from the film with a backdrop of the snowy mountain peaks, which is quite lovely to look at. I mean, the packaging on this is gorgeous. I just wish I liked the film more than I do. I mean, I think it's a good film, and I think the stunts are fantastic. It's, you know, mostly practical. It has some model work. You know, this is still in the primarily very early digital realm stage, so I do admire the craftsmanship here. I just wish the story was a bit more developed. And I'll admit, I'm a geek for narrative. I live for narrative, so I can handle an action movie that doesn't have a lot of narrative, but I just wish this had a bit more to it. I'll show you the rear cover, which is packed with notes, and you get a little bit of notes about the transfer and then the various bits of extra features you have. You get all kinds of behind the scenes footage, interviews with Renny Harlin and Stallone, and unfortunately, if you watch them all, it's much more kind of press kit based. It doesn't really give you a lot of meat into, you know, into the production history, and this stuff has all been carried over onto the DVDs and then the Blu-ray and such. So unfortunately, there's never really been like hardcore, really geeky extra features. There were some commentaries later on, but those really aren't that informative. But anyway, if you want the best version on Laserdisc and you want all the features, you want the deluxe packaging, you can pick this up for relatively cheap. You'll just want to make sure and get the reissue version that has the CLV disc and not the screwy CAV disc. Or if you want to pick this up or you find it for nothing, you can pick it up for completion's sake. And I don't know, maybe have a player that's actually going to work with this silly disc. That saying, the transfer is actually quite good. The only problem picture-wise is that it's prone to some aliasing. In fact, I'd say a lot of aliasing. You're going to notice a lot of artifacting and panning shots and wide shots where you have a lot of fine detail, especially in a lot of the buildings and the first couple reels, like the FBI headquarters and such, and a lot of the wide shots. So that's an unfortunate side effect, but in contrast, the color is actually very nice. And it's kind of interesting, if you look at this Laserdisc, the early DVDs, it kind of has a colder look to it, whereas the Superbit DVD and the Blu-ray have a much warmer look to it. I don't know if one's more accurate than the other, but it is a difference, I noticed. But what's really great is the sound is quite excellent. It's a PCM rendering of the Dolby Surround SR track, and it's really nice. You actually get the official old school Dolby SR Spectral Recording logo printed on here, and I just love all the old logos, so it's really cool to see it printed on a release. And if I'm remembering correctly, this film was blown up to 70mm, so I'm sure the 5.1 tracks are derived from that. Unfortunately, the Blu-ray has gone out of print for some reason. I think there's some foreign releases you can import, but if you're looking for an affordable release on any format here in the States and you want some extras, this is certainly the best packaging the film ever got, and it's the most stacked release on Laserdisc, and it's pretty cheap to pick up, so it's recommended. The picture quality is pretty good. It's not the greatest. The audio is quite good. Just make sure you don't grab this particular version with the messed up CAV disc. Here is a letterbox issue of the film Dangerous Game. It's credited as the original uncensored director's cut version. This was the film Abel Ferrara pretty much made. I think this is the film that came right after Bad Lieutenant, and I've never seen it all the way through, but again, when they pop up for this cheap, I figured, you know, since I really appreciate Bad Lieutenant so much, I've got to give this a watch. I do like the cover. You know, it's very simplistic, but it looks nice and it's very pleasing to the eye. And again, it is a, you know, mid-90s MGM letterbox release, and they really knew how to make Laserdiscs at this time. I think MGM overall had the most balanced number of good qualities. So and if I'm looking at a particular disc and I'm looking at what studio it comes from, if it comes from MGM, I'll pretty much go with it, because I know practically 9 times or 10 times out of 10 the disc transfer itself is going to be spot on. It does have a digital Dolby Surround track, and no special features outside of the original trailer and the fact that this is actually credited as unrated. I don't know, I think the regular video release, there may have been like a super heavy cut down version. I know Blockbuster didn't stock Bad Lieutenant at all. I think there might be like a heavily censored down R-rated version of that film, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm not sure about this one, but there might be. But anyway, if you're a fan of Ferrara or you've liked some of his other stuff, this is a relatively common disc, and again, I figured why not, since it's listed as the original uncut version. Here is the Warner's letterbox release of Dave, the Ivan Reitman picture that's, you know, it's essentially a satirical comedy about politics. I guess that'd be the simplest and easiest way to describe it. And it's been an extremely long time since I've seen this, so I've got to spin this up. Of course, this being a Warner disc, they have the tiny little widescreen logo. Otherwise, you would have no idea this is actually widescreen. Standard looking back cover, but at least they got away finally at this time from the old school Warner Brothers black box and random colors with pictures rear cover, because that really gets old after seeing it dozens and dozens of times. Has a Dolby Stereo digital PCM track, and again, I haven't got to see this because I haven't seen this film in ages. So I've just been picking up things that, you know, I either saw as a kid, or, you know, it's been a long time, or I remember seeing it partially on cable, because, you know, a lot of these discs, when you get closer, you know, in the early 90s and then early to mid 90s, Laserdiscs are almost always going to be a commonly available title. They were pressed in bigger numbers. They all are primarily letterbox with better transfers than 80s discs. So, you know, sometimes I just do blind buys like this, and I figure, you know, when I finally do get to rewatch it, since these are so cheap, I can't say no. Here's one that a lot of people on the Laserdisc Forever group are big fans of. This is the Warner Brothers letterbox release of Demolition Man. You would think this film had dated horribly by now, but it has such a charm to it that it actually kind of still works. Yeah, if you've never seen the film, it's definitely worth a watch at least once. I do like this cover artwork. It looks a lot better on the Laserdisc jacket than the smaller DVD size. Show you the rear here. Again, a nicer rear cover. Warner Brothers is finally, at this point, starting to make more attractive looking covers than just the same thing over and over and over again. This is a letterbox transfer with a Dolby Surround digital PCM track. No AC3 on this release. It kind of predates that just by a little bit. This just came out in '94, so it's right before AC3 really starts coming to prominence in '95. And of course, there are a lot of studios who didn't really do AC3. They would kind of tiptoe into the waters a little bit. They do some releases, and then they turn around and do some releases without AC3 at all. And then, of course, there's some discs that only had AC3 or DTS on the Japanese versions, and then vice versa. So you really have to look around and do some research if you want to see which disc had AC3, or if it didn't get discrete surround sound until DVD. But still, this is a nice release you can pick up. It's you know, it is a common disc, but I will say I actually haven't come across it, you know, just in the wild very often. So I guess people buy this and hang on to it. But it's definitely worth a watch. It's a really nice Laserdisc. Of course, the film actually references Laserdisc in it. Sort of a silly side joke, but anyway. Definitely worth a watch. Nice transfer, nice soundtrack, and one of the more winning Stallone films, I think. Now here is a very common Laserdisc title, but it's still good to give a rewatch every once in a while. This is the release of Four Weddings and a Funeral. You can find this practically everywhere, but this is one of those sleeper hits that just kind of came out of nowhere in the 90s, and then just all of a sudden you've always heard it referenced, and it's been kind of ripped off from a billion times by all the silly rom-coms that came out afterwards. I'll show you the rear cover here. And you wouldn't know this is actually a letterbox release. You have to look down here at this little text here saying deluxe widescreen version. Well, why wouldn't you put that on the front somewhere? Because it looks like a pan and scan disc. It's from Polygram Video. It has a Dolby Surround stereo track, which again, you wouldn't know that outside of seeing here and then seeing the tiny Dolby logo down here. So don't be fooled thinking this is a pan and scan disc. So it is definitely widescreen. It's a pretty nice transfer. It's not the greatest, but I actually was quite amused coming back to this. It had been so long since I'd seen it, and I do think it kind of holds up pretty well. And again, it's an extremely common disc. You can usually get this for $1 or less at least. So if you come across it and you've never seen it, or it's been a long while, absolutely worth a rewatch. Here is the Universal release of For Love or Money, directed by Barry Levinson, if I'm remembering correct. Sorry, Barry Sonnenfeld. Sorry. Sometimes you get your berries mixed up. But anyway, nice looking Universal release. I picked this copy up sealed, so I figured it looked interesting enough. I think I've seen part of this on cable once, so I'm going to have to spin this up and actually see it all the way through. Simple looking single disc Universal release, has a Dolby Surround stereo digital track, so that should sound pretty good. Simple disc, no trailer, no features or anything, but again, just a 90s comedy that turns up for super cheap on Laserdisc. Now here's a pretty important one, and a pretty well-known one among Laserdisc circles. This is the Warner Brothers letterbox release of The Fugitive, which is a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. It's really one of the great, nuts and bolts, well put together thrillers of the entire decade, and is a heck of a lot better than you wind up remembering, because usually I'd go for a long time before I'd come back to it. Anyway, beautiful usage of the original art. Unfortunately, no gatefold, so you're going to have discs in here sliding around. They're going to cause creases and ring wear. It's a letterbox release, and this disc was actually used in a lot of store demo rooms back in the day. If I remember correctly, I know Culture Dog talks about that in one of his videos, remembering them using the train crash scene for demonstrating Dolby Surround in your home and what it would sound like to have Laserdisc, PCM, Dolby Surround in your house. And that scene actually still holds up pretty well. The transfer does as well, and the sound again is excellent. It is a Dolby Surround PCM track. There's no AC3 on here. I think that popped up on the first DVD. Again, packaging is outstanding. I love how they actually put the stills into a stylized framework to fit with the kind of slash design of the imagery on the front. They kept the text in the same design. They kept the original poster typeface here. It's a beautiful, perfectly done jacket. It's worth it for the jacket alone, and it's a lot more impressive looking than the DVD and Blu-rays being shrunk down to a small size. Now, the reason why this disc is pretty well known, this is another notorious rotter title, and this disc is no exception. Interestingly enough, it is a mixture of CAV and CLV. Side 1 is the CAV side, so you get the train crash here in CAV, but side 2 and side 3 are CLV. Usually side 3 would be the one that would be CAV. They'd put the majority of the movie on the first two sides, and then as a bonus, they'd give you the final side as CAV, because that's usually where the big action sequence would be, and then they also only had a little bit of movie left, so then they just used the shorter disc size instead of wasting a whole CLV side. But anyway, on this particular disc, side 1 plays fine, but at the end of every disc side is where you start hitting rot. Again, side 1 plays through just fine, but about chapter 17, 18, And about chapter 9, 10, you start getting a little bit of speckling, and it starts to get worse and worse and worse, and then eventually it's heavy speckling, and then the audio starts going completely out into the digital track before it just completely goes to full rot and just is unplayable for the last 2 to 3 minutes of either side. So again, it's not it's going to depend on your copy. There are some people who have come across copies that are rot free, but if you're wanting a copy of this film on Laserdisc without any rot, you're going to have to search out the really hard to find squeeze disc. There was a very limited release of this film with the same jacket artwork, but it was actually one of the very few discs to have an anamorphic squeeze applies to the transfer. Most of these discs came out in Japan, but it looks like this one was made pretty much for store demo rooms as like a promotional disc, and it's very rare and hard to come by. But I think the only difference on the artwork is there's a little mention down here, like one of those little boxes with a line around it saying this disc is manufactured with an anamorphic squeeze to fit 16:9 television screens, or something of that effect. So that's how you're going to be able to tell it apart, or if you memorize the little catalog number. So that's something to look out for if you're wanting a version on Laserdisc that isn't going to rot out on you. But again, those are very hard to find. They go for a lot of money, and you're probably going to be better off just getting the first DVD, which is a port of this. But of course, being an early DVD, it looks pretty crummy, has a lot of issues, and the first Blu-ray was not very good. But they've since made a Blu-ray reissue with a freshened up transfer and a couple new extras. So I would recommend that version if you've never seen the film and you don't want to have to deal with rot issues, because it's going to happen on this. There's like a 95% chance if you pick this up, it's going to have rot on it somewhere. It's a really, really bad rotter title. So again, I would recommend, I want to say it's the 20th anniversary reissue, but it's you can tell it's got a couple extras, and it has the cover is rendered in white instead of having black as the background. But again, if you come across this and you feel like giving a chance with the the rot roulette wheel, or you're like me and you just like the disc artwork, it's other than the rot issues, it's a great Laserdisc, and the sound is great. And again, it's important because it used to be used as a demonstration title. So there's The Fugitive. All right, here we have the widescreen edition of Gettysburg. This is actually quite a substantial release due to the sheer size and length of the film. Of course, the film was so long that it played in limited runs in theaters, almost always with an intermission. So I haven't actually spun this particular copy up yet. It's been a while since I've seen the film, and there was a later box set version that I think came with like a replica Civil War bullet and some extras and a really big box set, but that's relatively rare and goes for much bigger dollars. This is a pretty common release that you can pick up for a couple bucks, and due to the sheer size alone, it's definitely worth $1 or $2. You get a rather nice trifold release. Here's your chapter index. The film's spread across 5 sides, and you get a really nice bit of maps and historical information. You get a whole panel of production notes and information about the film and the production. And then over here on this side, you get an actual section of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So even though it looks pretty simple, this is actually, I think, a really well put together little release. And again, of course, it was later supplanted by the box set version. But still, for just a regular standard release, of course, the film's going to be so long, and I'm sure it must have been pretty difficult to get the entire film on Laserdisc in a standard release. So I gotta admit, I think the packaging on this is actually pretty darn good. Although I don't quite know about the purple kind of background of the front cover. Rear cover looks pretty nice. Just nice use of backdrop here. It's a image release via Turner Home Entertainment, because Ted Turner was pretty much 100% behind this film, and I think that's practically about the only reason it got made and then shown in theaters at the length it was. It's letterbox with a digital Dolby Surround soundtrack. There's the logo over here. Later releases do have a 5.1 mix. I don't know if this film played in 5.1 theatrically. Again, I was too young to see it at the time. Wish I'd been able to, and I don't think it's ever really gotten any archival or revival screenings. And I definitely think it's something to go back to. It's practically the only, you know, major, relatively large budget, and especially lengthy Civil War film of the modern era. Gods and Generals notwithstanding, because that's really an extremely long mixed bag, and then there's an even longer director's cut version of that film, so I need to revisit it at some point, but I think this film is much stronger, of course, and I certainly couldn't imagine watching both of them back to back. But anyway, it's a rather nice, well put together common release that you can pick up for nothing, and you know, getting a film of this quality and this length on a well-made Laserdisc for dirt cheap, you know, it's a really nice release for what it is. Just keep in mind you're going to have to get later versions or the Blu-ray to get any special features or extras, because this is movie only. There is the Steven Soderbergh film King of the Hill. Nice looking Universal release. I picked this one up sealed, so I don't mind the little bit of corner wear there. Anyway, I have not seen this film before. I've heard of it, I've read about it, but I'm kind of going back and checking out some of the Soderbergh films that I've either missed or not seen in a while or just never gotten around to. So this looks like a pretty nice disc. It's actually a nicer cover for a Universal title. I think all the studios were kind of getting much better at making their discs look more attractive by 93, 94, and not just using the same old generic stuff. Single disc, two-sided, CLV with a Dolby Surround stereo digital track, so I don't think you're going to get better than this for the audio, and I'm sure the transfer is going to be pretty good, so I'll have to check this one out. Now here's one that I have, again, not seen in a long time. This is the letterbox release of Little Buddha, which has always seemed to me kind of an oddball of a film, because you have Keanu and you have, you know, it's a film about kids in essence, and it was made by Bernardo Bertolucci. It just seems like a complete collage of things that really shouldn't go together. So again, I have not really seen this since I was a kid practically, and I just figured, why not? It's a letterbox release with a Dolby Surround digital track. It's a Miramax disc, which means it's a Disney release, and as you can see, it has all the hallmarks of being a Disney disc. It has the old stereo logo and all the kind of same layout as all the Touchstone and other Disney discs of the 90s. But again, letterbox 90s release, figured why not? So I'll have to spin this up and see what that's like. Here's the Warner Brothers letterbox release of the Mel Gibson film The Man Without a Face. Nice looking artwork. I think a lot of these, you know, more general looking art pieces, they look much more impressive on a Laserdisc jacket like they would on the theatrical one sheet, as opposed to a little DVD cover, or, you know, what you get now, which is the little streaming box on a, you know, app or a menu, and then half the times they just pull a generic picture or make a new generic Photoshop image of the actor's face instead of using the artwork. Again, nice, simple, but effective rear cover. Continues the artwork from the front. We've finally gotten away from that generic Warner Brothers rear cover. Simple, movie-only disc with a Dolby Surround digital track. So, you know, it's a nice release. It's a well-made, decent film. You know, coming back to this was my first time watching it practically since I saw it on cable once, so it was better than I remembered. And of course it is letterboxed, and you get a little blurb about this film is in 185 the way it was intended. Of course, I actually kind of wished that generic sentence would start coming back to actually, you know, start explaining to people again about the importance of ratios, because pan and scanning is actually starting to come back, except instead of pan and scanning for 133, they're instead doing it for 178 16:9 frames. And with the advent of digital photography, true scope photography, 235 scope photography has really kind of died out. Things just get masked off, either digitally or theatrically. So I think it would be nice to actually start having these sentence little blurbs return with the correct aspect ratio listed. So anyway, if you're interested in this film, it's a very common disc title, and you can get it for practically nothing. Again, here's another film I have never seen, and simply from the cast and crew alone, I figured I'd give it a shot. This is the Universal Letterbox release of Mad Dog and Glory. I have never seen this, so I'm going to have to check this out. I think it's interesting. This is one of the Universal discs where they kind of went with a different color, this kind of brown. I mean, it looks quite nice. I guess it's more, it almost has a gold tinge, so it matches the typeface of the actors' names here. Show you the rear cover. It's an okay, but you know, regular looking Universal rear cover. No special features, no trailer, but it has a Dolby Surround digital track, so it should represent the theatrical release print very well. So I'm gonna have to give this a shot. Interesting. Sorry, there's so many of these that I've just picked up that, you know, I've either never seen or it's been a long time. But again, most of my collection comes from, you know, 90s films, because that's the majority of what's out there. Here is the deluxe widescreen presentation of My Life. Of course, I'm a big Michael Keaton fan, so I had to just go for it. If I remember correctly, this is a DADC Columbia release. Yes, it is. And the reason why I picked this one up is there's the all-important kind of sticker down here, manufactured in Austria. And what that refers to is, instead of being made at the DADC plant here in the States, it was manufactured at their plant in Austria. And the reason why that's important is practically every time you find a rotted disc that's from DADC and it's a Columbia title, if you manage to find a version pressed at the DADC Austria plant, it's going to be without those rot issues. So it's really important to look for this sticker or look in the disc ring and check to see if you have a version made in Austria, or, you know, if you're looking in the stores, you can pull up the LDB listing on your phone and see if it had an Austrian pressing and see what the identifying marks are going to be, because you can then buy relatively with confidence and not have to worry about rot issues. And this, like my handful of other ones I've found, is absolutely rot free. So this is one of those. Look for the DADC Austria pressing. Anyway, pretty nice looking rear cover. Columbia was a lot better, I think, about making attractive looking jackets that matched the films. Dolby Surround digital track, no EC3 or anything, but it's a pretty good film, and I think it holds up better than others of this kind of genre. And it's a nice disc release if you can find the Austrian pressing. Here's the Warner Brothers Letterbox release of The Pelican Brief, the adaptation of the John Grisham novel, directed by Alan J. Pakula. I think is another one of the great, truly underrated American directors. Uses the original poster art quite well, and I think this looks really nice on Laserdisc, just like the other releases like The Client or Time to Kill. They just look more impressive on Laserdisc. It is a letterbox release and very common, so you can pick this up for really cheap. This one's a little dinged up because, again, they just didn't do gatefolds over at Warner Brothers. They just shoved all their discs in, so it's got some ring wear and some corner dings and such. But again, you can get these for so cheap, and the artwork looks nice. I don't mind a couple dings and a little roughed up cover. It's spread across 3 sides, no special features. Has a really nice Dolby Surround digital track. And that's how the film would have played in theaters originally, because this is still predating 5.1 by a little bit. So relatively nice transfer, good color. It looks a little different from the Blu-ray version, so And if you have it on DVD, it's pretty much the same master, but of course that's an earlier DVD with some of the kind of nastiness of early DVD transfers. So you don't really lose a whole lot by going back to the Laserdisc. You get a better soundtrack. So again, it's a really competent thriller. It's well made, but you could pick it up for nothing, so why wouldn't you? Here we have another DADC disc. This is Philadelphia, the letterbox edition. Very common title that also is very heavily rot prone. I love how they printed the original poster artwork here. I think it looks really classy, and I think this is definitely the best packaging the film's had. I think when they go away from this artwork or mess with it or change the levels and such, it just doesn't look as striking and important. And the reason why I picked this up is it has the all-important manufactured in Austria sticker. It is rot-free, looks and sounds excellent, unlike the rotty US version. It has a Dolby Surround digital track, which again sounds nice and is how you would have heard the film on its theatrical release. It includes the Bruce Springsteen Streets of Philadelphia music video, so you get that bonus and having the song rendered in PCM stereo, and that sounds great. Really nice bit of production notes, very classy, standard looking Sony Columbia disc. And if I remember correctly, this little last bit is, this last little bit is an actual quote from Tom Hanks himself about why he wanted to do the film, why he felt it was important. So I think that's a nice touch. So again, nice Laserdisc. Pick it up if you find the Austrian pressing. Here's a pretty common title that, you know, the film isn't the greatest, but I had to just pick it up. This is the Fox Letterbox edition of Rising Sun, and even though it's, you know, very generic, I do like the cover artwork. It's very bold, having the actors' faces here right under their surnames billed like that. It very proudly carries the THX mastering moniker up here with a small Fox logo. And the Fox Video logo is actually rendered in color, so this being a, you know, better Fox transfer, you get the fancier logos. Has a Dolby Surround digital track, which sounds quite nice. You get the THX stamp on the back as well. Get some production notes and the standard Fox typeface, but it's in a much nicer, more striking jacket, which is actually kind of printed with a glossy stock, which is nice. I got this copy for really cheap because it's a little dinged up, and I don't mind it for that because I was just grabbing it to compare to the Blu-ray and its 5.1 lossless track. And I have to say, this transfer actually holds up pretty well. It's got some very saturated looking color, even in comparison to the Blu-ray and DVDs. So it's actually quite nice to look at, and the sound is excellent, even though it's only Matrix 2.0. So if this is the only version you have, or you find it for $1 or something, it's definitely worth it. The film, of course, is based on the Michael Crichton novel, directed by Philip Kaufman. If you're a fan of Connery or Snipes, then definitely give it a watch. It's a solid 90s action thriller. It's not the greatest film in the world, but, you know, it does have its charms. It does work, and it's a nice transfer on Laserdisc, and one of Fox's better ones from the early 90s. I feel like this should say hoo-ah every time you pull it out. This is the Universal Letterbox release of Scent of a Woman, which of course is infamous for Pacino's performance and uttering that catchphrase over and over. Of course, this uses the original poster artwork really nicely on a standard Universal Letterbox format. I just think it's a rather nice cover. Letterbox transfer with the original Dolby Surround is PCM. Spread across 3 sides, no special features, so it's pretty much a standard release otherwise. Again, regular looking Universal rear cover, but you know, it looks nice since this is not only white, but actually, if you look very closely, it has kind of the same city background skyline kind of neatly laid underneath the credit information here. So that's at least something different than having just generic background base color. So anyway, it's a nice release of a film that actually holds up better than you realize when you go back and revisit it. And you know, it's going to be pretty much the same as the DVD, and if I remember correctly, I don't think this film has come out on Blu-ray yet. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's not available in HD. So it's a common title you can pick up for nothing if you haven't seen the film in a long time or you're thinking about seeing it again. Here is another DADC issue pressing where you need to track down the Austrian version. This is the deluxe widescreen version of Sleepless in Seattle, and I was lucky enough to find this sealed, and it is in fact an Austrian pressing, which means it is rot free. It's a nice looking Columbia release. Replaces an earlier disc. I think that one was Pan and Scan, and it's a nice looking transfer with Dolby Surround PCM, so you get the original film mix, get a nice bit of production notes and sort of the way Columbia discs would be laid out with your chapter stops listed here. No special features or anything. I guess the biggest special feature is that it doesn't have laser rot. The only other thing I noticed about this rear cover that kind of jumps out at me, I love seeing old style bloopers in text, whether it's spelling errors or just general goofs. And I just happen to know, this being the gigantic Bond fan that I am, that it lists Carrie Lowell as being from The Living Daylights, when of course she was in License to Kill. So just one of those lovely little bloopers I happened to accidentally catch, and I just love little things like that. So anyway, it's a nice looking release, and it is very common, but what's not common is actually finding the Austrian pressing. So be sure and check that one out. I don't think the American pressing has like heavy rot issues. I may be wrong, but anytime you have a DADC disc, it's most likely, you know, going to have potential rot issues develop at some point. And if you can find an Austrian pressing, it's definitely recommended to avoid that nastiness. Here is Warner Brothers letterbox release of the film Summersby. I have not seen this film, but I read Nick Meyer's memoirs not too long ago, and which I actually highly recommend even for non-Star Trek fans. It's a really nice, you know, film show business kind of look back. It's a nice book. You can get it for dirt cheap. If I remember correctly, I think it's called Views from the Bridge, and so I was interested to go back and see his other films, non-Star Trek, or Time After Time, for example, which is a great underrated film. You know, other films he wrote, directed, produced, etc., was involved in. So I stumbled across this, which he wrote the screenplay for. It's a letterbox Warner release, and of course, look, just when you think you've gotten away, the generic Warner Brothers rear cover comes back. That being said, I do think this looks quite nice. It's more of a parchment style color, and the bronze gold just kind of seems to go with it in the overall film setting and tone. So I don't mind, but it's just strange having it gone to all of a sudden reappear for no apparent reason. But anyway, letterboxed Warner's release, Dolby Surround digital track, so I'm going to have to check this one out, but it looks otherwise like a nice, simple Warner Brothers release. Again, this is another film I've never seen, but it is the Warner Brothers letterbox release of Being Human. And, you know, after Robin Williams' untimely death, I was really kind of motivated to finally go back and see more of his, you know, lesser known or kind of forgotten roles and such, because I feel like a lot of comedic performers that he was an extraordinarily underrated dramatic actor. And I've just always enjoyed seeing him in various films, you know, where he's not having to, you know, play up his insanely gifted comedic talents. You know, films like 1 Hour Photo, or which of course is an incredible performance, or I even love the kind of bit part he has as the philosophy-minded former psychologist in Dead Again, which is a great, darkly comedic, but yet heartfelt little performance. That is a movie in and of itself. But anyway, this release of Being Human is a standard Warner Brothers non-gatefold. I was surprised to pick it up still sealed without any real cover damage. Of course, because it's sealed, you know, you start to have the ring wear issue, which comes from not using a gatefold. Again, Warner's why? Gatefolds are used by everybody but you, why? Anyway, mini rant over. Film spread across 3 sides, no special features. Again, a standard Warner's release, but they did encode side 3 as CAV. Dolby Surround digital track, so that should sound fine. Another nice looking release of a film I have to make time to actually sit down and watch. Here is the MGM UA letterbox release of Blown Away, which is an interesting 94 thriller that kind of has gotten forgotten, and I think is really kind of made by the strength of the 2 lead performers. This is the letterbox edition. It's very common to find it on the pan and scan version, which is identical, just without the letterbox moniker up here, so be sure and grab this if you're wanting it with the letterbox moniker. And I do believe this also got a DTS reissue, but of course that's exceptionally rare, so you can get the standard version for like $1 or $2. Of course, it's available on DVD, and it was just released on Blu-ray not too long ago by Kino Lorber, so if you wanted an HD, it's available. Nice looking rear cover, I think. I like the design and the black background spread across 3 sides. What confuses a lot of people, this is one of the handful of films that came out with the DTS stereo moniker. And all that essentially means is it was DTS's attempt to cash in on Dolby's success with Dolby Stereo matrixing equipment and processes, because Dolby was pretty much unchallenged in that, and every film print had to carry an optical track backup even during the digital era. So DTS wanted to do their own version to get a market share of that. It never really took off because people already had their Dolby equipment. It was pretty much an industry standard. So DTS would do their own version of it, but since they work exactly the same thing and do the same thing, and it's the same process, it's just a few differences between the 2 companies. So in terms of disc formats, they're going to be identical. You're going to use the same decoding format. Whatever you use to decode Dolby Surround, it's going to work for these DTS stereo tracks. So don't be confused by that. It is not 5.1, it is a 2.0 matrix track. It's the same thing you're going to find with the discs that are listed as Ultra Stereo. It was a lower budgeted, similar process used by a lot of smaller, more independent films in the late 80s, early 90s and such, as an alternative for paying for the Dolby license. Mostly you'll see DTS stereo titles as MGM releases. There's only really a handful of them, but I've noticed they seem to all be MGM discs. I don't know if they tried to do another licensing deal at the time to be more affordable than Dolby or something, but anyway, that's what that means. That's all it is. Don't go away thinking it's a DTS disc, because unfortunately it's not. There is a DTS version of this, but of course very expensive, very rare. It is now available on Blu-ray via Kino Lorber though, if you're interested. Here's a film I picked up I have no idea about. This is the film Chasers. The reason why I picked it up, it was directed by Dennis Hopper, so I figured it was worth checking out. Whether it's good or bad or not is still yet unknown. It's a Letterbox Warner Brothers release. A little dinged up, but it was less than $1, so interesting motif, keeping with the Armed Forces theme by having the red, white, and blue background. Of course, this being a later 90s Warner's disc, the jacket at least is a little bit more inspired, so I'll have to check this out and see if it's worth the $1 or not. But anything Dennis Hopper did is, at least so far, all his other stuff has been either interesting or, you know, not everything can be easy rider, but I figured I'd give it a shot. Dolby Surround digital track, no AC3 or anything, but again, just an oddball 90s film I'd never really heard of, so I figured I'd give it a chance. Here's a fantastic Laserdisc. This is the original letterbox edition of The Crow, the fantastic film by Alex Proyas, starring the late Brandon Lee. Gets a THX mastering stamp, a Dolby Surround stereo digital track. Pretty nice letterbox transfer, actually. It's a very hard film to transfer with the bold color scheme, well, the bold colors and the dark color scheme, and the dark lighting, and then the special effects shots and such. So it's not going to be the easiest film to transfer onto analog, but this disc holds up pretty darn well. Of course, the THX stamp doesn't necessarily mean very much, but it's nice to see that. This is a Miramax release, so it's technically a Disney disc. You can see the standard cover jacket artwork here, but it looks quite nice, fits with the film with the black and red. A straightforward disc, single disc, two-sided, really nice transfer again, but the real stunner is the soundtrack. This is an extremely forceful PCM Dolby Stereo track. Lots of bass content, plenty for your subwoofer to play with, even though it isn't an AC3 release. This was later replaced by an AC3 version. It seems to be the same disc, they just added an AC3 track and I think a little bit of a bonus featurette at the end of the movie. So you can track that one down. It's pretty much the same jacket, it just has a little corner blurb here. That's how you tell them apart. But this disc is no slouch. The 2.0 is fantastic. It's a really great audio mix. And there is a DTS version, but again, that's later release, very rare. But anyway, great presentation of still, I think, an underrated movie that you know, sadly had to be adjusted quite a bit in the editing after Lee's untimely death on the set, but still, nice jacket, and it's a really nice laser disc, very common, and you can get it for practically $1, and the audio is stellar. Here is the Wesley Snipes thriller Drop Zone, directed by John Badham. That's really the reason why I picked this up. I've never seen this, but I've been trying to check out more films of various directors who I've either, you know, followed a couple of their things or liked a couple of their things. So again, this is a John Badham thriller from 1994, gets a THX mastering stamp pressed by Pioneer, a Paramount release, so you get their widescreen banner. It has a Dolby Surround 2.0 track, and it does have 5.1 AC3. Other than that, simple, straightforward movie-only disc. You know, not anything special, but still interesting. And again, when these AC3 THX discs are $1 or less, it's just, no one who starts collecting these can say no to any of these, because you know you're at least going to get a good, solid presentation, and sometimes with a really killer 5.1 track. No, the audio on this is pretty good. It's not exceptional, but you know, it sounds good, and once you finally get your RF demodulator, you know, the more AC3 you can throw at it, the better. Here's one most people have. This is the letterbox release of Forrest Gump. Paramount disc, so I do like how they kind of kept this nice and plain and gave you pretty much the original one sheet on here. Of course, it looks nice on the Laserdisc jacket, having the additional space for the white area. You get all your banners at the bottom, which is a nice touch, and they're colored blue and dark gray to kind of go with the cover and not spoil your eyes and draw away from the key art. Credited as a deluxe edition with a behind-the-scenes special at the end. Do get a gatefold. It's actually a pretty nice one. This showing Forrest at the Capitol Mall. And here you get the blurb about the special feature. It's essentially like a 35-minute making of featurette, one of those talking head things, but still nice to actually have it on Laserdisc, because most of the time you wouldn't get much of anything. So it's pretty substantial, and of course the audio is going to sound better because it's still PCM encoded. Show you the rear cover here. Pretty straightforward. Other than that bonus feature, you don't really get any other features. The soundtrack is encoded as Dolby Surround 2.0, and there's a 5.1 AC3 digital track. However, if you play back that digital track, you're not going to get anything in the surrounds. It's mixed in a very weird way, to where it's pretty much just in the front channels. Why this is, nobody knows. It's just how this particular disc is, and I saw this in the theater, but I was very young at the time, and of course most theaters were still playing 2.0 Dolby SR stereo, so you would have only heard the 2.0 in most theaters at the time. So I don't know if that 5.1 was always mixed that way, or it's just on this disc, but you'll want to go with the 2.0 and matrix it back out, because you'll get all the surround information that's supposed to be there. It's not a whole lot or anything, but if you've ever heard the DVDs or the Blu-ray or the 4K with its 5.1 remix tracks, you know, it's going to sound a lot more like that. But Don't think anything's broken if you play the 5.1 AC3 on this disc and you're not getting any surround information, because it's there, but on the 2.0 track. So it's just one of those rare few titles where the 2.0 is a lot better than the 5.1. Again, why, nobody really knows. It just is. So here is the remake of The Getaway from Universal. Nice looking jacket. It just really fits with the starry background because the black kind of fades into it, and the red letterbox lines always look nice, I think. I think the jackets of theirs that went with red always kind of look better than most. Gets a 2.0 Dolby Surround track, which sounds quite nice. There is an uncut version of this disc. The only way that you tell the difference, it's like maybe I don't even think it's 2 minutes. I think it's like maybe a minute and a half. It's like 2 scenes were trimmed down to avoid an NC-17. And the jackets and catalog numbers are almost identical. You just have to look for a little marker. I think it's on the front of the jacket. I think it'll say it's unrated somewhere right here. But I mean, it's not like you're missing a whole lot. I just picked this up cheap. I didn't realize that both versions had come out, but they look almost identical. So anyway, single disc, no special features, standard Universal release otherwise. Again, I don't know why they put both out on, they look almost identical, but that's just the way they did it. So just be forewarned. Here is the Universal release of Greedy, directed by Jonathan Lynn. I picked this up because of some of the cast members, and because I'm such a huge fan of Clue, I've been meaning to check out other films that Jonathan Lynn directed. So I haven't got the chance to spin this up yet, but doesn't really have a good reputation or anything, but again, with that cast and crew, I figured why not. It's a standard Universal letterbox release, Dolby Surround stereo track, so it should shape up pretty well, I should think. Here is the Laserdisc of Hoop Dreams, the classic documentary that really kind of challenges the boundaries of what is a documentary. And, you know, a lot of people point to this as one of the great documentaries, like, for example, Errol Morris's Thin Blue Line and others, that really kind of, started to promote the documentary as not just being, an informational video or, a dreary old newsreel or something. That's a pretty nice release, and of course, this was not produced on a major budget originally, so it's not like you're going to lose a lot by watching a 133 Laserdisc, which this is. It has a digital soundtrack that does have Dolby Surround encoding, I think. Oh no, sorry, it has the ultra stereo encoding, like I mentioned before. As you can see, this was a lower budgeted film, but it really kind of transcends that, I think, at least. Spread across 3 sides, it looks and sounds quite nice, especially for the source materials that it uses and other things. So highly recommended, even if you're not a sports fan, which I'm certainly not. But it is one of the really important American documentaries. And again, you can pick this up for nothing. It's since come out on DVD, and I'm pretty sure it's out on Blu-ray as well now. But a nice Laserdisc release via Image and Turner Home Entertainment. So pretty rare for documentaries to get like full-on, really good Laserdisc releases. This is a film I think is kind of underrated and relatively forgotten. This is the feature adaptation of Maverick, directed by Richard Donner, and it's a pretty darn nice transfer, actually. Has a 2.0 Dolby Stereo surround track, which this film's never had a 5.1 on disc. The DVD didn't have one, and the new Blu-ray doesn't either, so I think it just may have been released that way. You can see Warner's is starting to get into sort of a roll with these, finally getting away from that rear jacket design. The disc jacket looks really nice, spread across 3 sides, final side being CAV encoded, which is always a bonus. the DVD pretty much copied the disc jacket artwork and the disc transfer itself, just with lossy Dolby 2.0. Of course, the film's now finally come out on Blu-ray, and the transfer is a bit better, but it's not super great or anything. They're never going to put a lot into this because it was not a huge success and kind of got quickly forgotten, but I think it holds up pretty darn well. And of course, anytime you have any type of Western film with a decent budget, a decent script and cast, I just get excited. And so it could be terrible if you hold it up against others, but I get excited because, hey, it's a Western from the last 25 years. I can't believe it. So anyway, very common Laserdisc, nice transfer, good sound, and you know, it's just I think this is a film that you really can't make today, really. If they even tried, you know, they'd go too far into the comedy vein or too far into the action vein. So this is kind of the balance, I think. And you know, revisiting it, it actually kind of holds up much better than I thought. I had completely forgotten about it myself. So anyway, just another common disc that holds up pretty well, I think. Here is the Paramount release of Nobody's Fool, pressed by Pioneer, letterboxed edition. And for some reason, I don't know why, this disc is really common. I guess Paramount pressed up a big batch of this title for some reason. Standard release, Dolby Surround digital audio, no 5.1 or anything. This is just a really solid 90s drama, and of course I have to see Paul Newman in anything, so it's an absolute must. It has come to DVD, and I don't think it's come to Blu-ray yet, so the Laserdisc will have the better audio. No special features, but again, this is a super common title which you can pick up for nothing, and if you're at all a Paul Newman fan, go for it. Here's the Universal letterbox release of The River Wild. Gets the THX mastering stamp. Has a Dolby 2.0 stereo surround track. No 5.1, but there was later a DTS release. The jacket's kind of gotten a little weathered and it's turned a little brown, but again, it's a common title. I picked it up for super cheap, so I wanted to see this since Curtis Hanson, the director, had died in the past couple years, so I had only seen parts of this on cable, so I'm going to have to spin this up and watch it all the way through. Of course, I'm a big fan of LA Confidential, so I wanted to see some of his other work, because I pretty much only know him from that. And I'm sure there's a lot of other people who are kind of in that same boat. So I'll have to check that one out. Now here's one a lot of people have had rot trouble with. This is the letterbox release of The Shawshank Redemption. Of course, this being a Sony Columbia disc, it's pressed at DADC, and that means run for the hills. However, I found this locally, and I decided to give it a shot because the cover was in pretty good shape too. And of course, like Warner Brothers, this one is just disc shoved in a thinner jacket, which is very prone to getting beat up. So, I mean, it looks really nice. Of course, you get a lot of nice liner notes here, and of course they're printed very small because I don't know why Columbia discs are that way. That's just how they are. But anyway, it's just a really nice, classy looking release. I think it's the best cover art any of the discs have got, because the new releases have the beautiful Drew Struzan poster artwork on it, but it's printed so small on the Blu-ray cover, it doesn't really have much of an impact. Anyway, the film's spread across 3 sides, no special features, but it does have the original Dolby Stereo soundtrack, which has been remixed into 5.1 for all the later releases. And while there aren't really any changes made, I just hate whenever a film's original soundtrack gets lost, because sometimes when they remix stuff, you know, there's different equalization applied, sometimes there's overzealous noise reduction, sometimes things accidentally get lost, and being a purist, I just like having the original option there. So if you want to hear the original audio, you pretty much are stuck trying to track this down. Now the transfer is actually really solid. It's a 185 transfer. The color's good, the detail is is really nice. I was quite surprised. It's definitely watchable. And what was really great is this doesn't have any rot on it, which was really fantastic to see. I just bought it with fingers crossed and figured I'd give it a try, but a lot of people have had big rot issues with this one, or at least enough to kind of ruin the experience of watching it. And of course, it's a longer film, so you know, it's easier to deal with rot if the movie's under 90 minutes, but when it's 142 minutes, then that's a little bit harder. So just be forewarned, you'll have to either find one like this or go through multiples and combine sides to get a rot-free one. Here's a really nice transfer. This is the widescreen edition of Stargate. It's the THX stamp pressed by Pioneer. There was later a letterbox THX release of the director's extended version, so that's also out there. It's pretty much the same cover but with a little bit different wording, and that's available, but you got to make sure you're not just buying another copy of this. I do like the packaging. This one's a little beat up, but it's a common title, and I just wanted to try the audio out, so I picked it up for $1 or so. Again, with these dollar discs, I don't mind some of the corner dings and ring wear and such. Anyway, the audio is fantastic. You get a 2.0 Dolby Surround track and, of course, a 5.1 AC3. The AC3 is the way to go. It's a really good, a really nice, bombastic track. I was quite surprised at how well it was mixed for the time. And it's not like this was a super giant main studio film, because it really wasn't. Of course, when this was first put out, even though it has the THX stamp, there was an error in the mastering where the audio had audio coming out of the wrong channels, like the rear came out of the front came out of the rear, and it had to be recalled. There's more information on the LDDB listing for this disc. You can look in the bottom. One of the comments goes on to describe this. And if you look, the typeface here, the little fine print, is actually a sticker that's been placed over here. And they mentioned that this is what you're going to look for to try to find a copy that was corrected, because they put new information over this, I guess, to distinguish them or fix a fine print legal error or something. But anyway, I played this through and the sound was fine, so I'm just going to assume if you want this and you want the corrected audio, you're going to have to look for one with this little corrected sticker on the rear cover, or you can just grab that director's cut version if you like the version of the film with all the footage put back in. I think it's about 10 to 15 minutes if I'm correct. Of course, now you can get the remastered Blu-ray with both cuts seamlessly branched and all the extras and things from the various DVDs and Blu-rays, and it's actually quite good. It's much better than the older HD transfers. But I just wanted to see what this looked and sounded like on Laserdisc, and the transfer's pretty good. It's a little on the noisy side, but the audio is great. So it's definitely worth the $1 you're going to pay for this, because, again, very common title, $1 or $2, and it has a really great AC3 track. So this is just one, get it for the AC3 alone, I'd say, because it's a really good, solid science fiction film with a really great audio track. Of course, you're going to pay a little bit more if you're going to try to find the director's cut version. That seems to be a little harder to find. Now here's one that just, I really can't explain it. It just kind of works for me. It's a little cheesy, but this is the Disney remake of The Three Musketeers, you know, the umpteenth version of Dumas's classic story. Basically, this is totally inspired by Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, as far as I'm concerned, right down to the plot structure and the cast and the way it was marketed and released, complete with, you know, another Bryan Adams-led song. Of course, it was Bryan Adams, Sting, and Rod Stewart, but still, it just reeks of trying to follow Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. But anyway, it's a really nice transfer. It's a really nice disc from Disney. Of course, you get their usual design, but it's a nice looking disc, I think. And the film barely got a DVD release, so this is going to really be almost equal, if not better, because you get a Dolby Surround PCM track, which sounds wonderful. It's a really nice, solid transfer, and you can get it for pretty cheap. I got this one sealed, and I was quite pleased by how good it looked and sounded. It's finally come to Blu-ray on their, but it's part of their Disney Movie Club where you have to be a member. And a lot of those titles, they have good new HD transfers, but they usually have lossy audio. So I think that one has lossless audio, but again, you're going to have to pay membership to their club and pay a lot just for getting the Blu-ray version. So short of that, I recommend this Laserdisc, even over the DVD, because you're going to get the better audio and the same picture transfer. And this is, of course, much cheaper. It says so here, very small, but it also has the nice THX sticker here proclaiming that, so to get the THX overseeing of the transfer. Again, that doesn't really mean much, but it's nice to see the logo there. So it's a nice romp and nice to watch on Laserdisc. Now here's a very important title. This is the Fox letterbox release of True Lies, THX mastered and all. Now, why is this important? Well, the reason is this is one of the first, well, it's technically the first, along with Clear and Present Danger, title to actually have AC3 5.1 encoded on the disc. So this and Clear and Present Danger were going to be the titles that were the launch for AC3, used in all the store demos. And this one, it's got a nice gatefold. It even comes with the insert with questions about Dolby AC3 digital surround. What do I do? Do I need a new Laserdisc player? Da 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 da. Just a simple paper insert, but I always like seeing this promotional stuff explaining the new technology of the future. And I thought it was really cool to actually find this in here. Otherwise, Fox release, you get the standard Fox whole panel of liner notes and pictures. Of course, being later, it looks much nicer. Show you the other side. Nice attractive panel with your chapter listings. Spread across 3 sides, and you get 2 trailers at the end. Now, it also, of course, has a Dolby Surround 2.0 PCM track, which I've sampled both. That also sounds nice, but the 5.1 is what you're buying this for. Of course, that 5.1 is pretty much going to be what you would have heard theatrically, as far as I can tell. The audio on this is fantastic. However, the picture quality has been, the master was subjected to quite a bit of noise reduction, so it's, gonna look a little smeary. Even on my CRT, I could kind of tell it's not really the pinnacle of Laserdisc picture quality. However, the audio is fantastic. Do keep in mind the DVD is actually the same exact master as this in picture and sound, so that's why that picture quality on that disc isn't the greatest. But if you don't have an RF demodulator and you want to hear the 5.1 AC3, you could pick up that DVD for dirt cheap and be able to hear it without a demodulator, as it's the same audio track. According to Disclord, who did all the research on this and posted on the LDTB forums, the DTS version, that's very rare and expensive, is actually better in picture and sound because it uses a higher bit rate source file than this did. Apparently this used a 16-bit master of the original audio for the AC3, and the DTS had access to like an 18 or 20-bit master. So the audio is not only encoded with a higher bit rate on the DTS pressing, but it was sourced from a better quality master. Now, I of course can't afford to have that disc to do a direct comparison, but I'll just have to take everybody's word for it that it does sound better. The picture quality, though, apparently is better because that master was not subjected to all of the noise reduction and other video post-production that was applied to this release and the subsequent DVD. So it's sad to say that because the Blu-ray still has not materialized of this, outside of the D-Theater and various HD versions floating around on broadcast and streaming, etc., that pop up, the best release you can get on disc is the DTS Laserdisc still. And of course, that being one of the more expensive and harder to obtain titles, and this disc going for $1 or $2 and being historically important as the AC3 launch disc with Clear and Present Danger, this is definitely a disc to have, not only for that historical importance, but for the fact that it's a good presentation of the film that still doesn't have a Blu-ray release. And again, if you want the DVD or you want to hear the 5.1, don't have a demodulator, you can get the DVD. But I will say, you know, despite me talking about the picture quality not being the greatest, it's still a perfectly watchable Laserdisc. It's a good, solid transfer. You know, it's just not gonna. It's not a 5-star for picture quality. It's a really good audio transfer. The 2.0 actually, I kind of sampled it to compare it to the 5.1, and it also holds its own. So if you get this and you don't have a demodulator, or you don't have 5.1 in your system, but you have the ability to do Dolby Matrix decoding, you're not going to miss all of the audio fun. So it's a nice 2.0 mix. It's a really great historically important AC3 track, and it does a really good job. I just wish the picture quality were better, and I wish I was able to test out the DTS version. And the real sad part is when it finally does arrive on Blu-ray, it's probably going to be subjected to the revisionism and all the heavy teal recoloring and audio being remixed, and then Cameron loves to remove all film grain. So I just hope it doesn't turn out like that horrendous 4K release of Terminator 2 that just came out this year, because that's just, it's terrible. So I hope that both True Lies and The Abyss actually get decent Blu-ray presentations instead of what I fear, just like what happened to the other Cameron films when they were re-released. Even Titanic has been recolored. So yeah, I just, for now, Laserdisc on these is pretty much about the best you can do, which is sad, but unfortunately true. Here's the Paramount release of the really good 90s drama, What's Eating Gilbert Grape. It's a nice solid letterbox transfer with a Dolby Surround digital track, which of course is going to sound better than the lossy audio on the DVD. I don't think this has come to Blu-ray, so you're pretty much choosing between Laserdisc and DVD. No special features, it's a movie-only disc, but this is a solid 90s drama that it actually holds up when you come back to it, so definitely recommended.